And now I want to introduce Rabbi Dr. Mitch Rocklin. Now, the bio that you have for Mitch is dated. He already has his PhD, so he is Rabbi Doctor. He is not working on the PhD. And he wears a few hats. He not only is a scholar, he was a resident research fellow at the Tikva Fund. He is now a postdoctoral fellow at the James Madison program at Princeton University. He's also a chaplain in the New Jersey Army National Guard. And when I wrote him about this, about a few details about the conference about a month ago, I think, or a month and a half ago, he was in Afghanistan. He was on duty in Iraq, and he had a hard time, writing something to me because I think he'd been for a few days without sleep or something. So he's a chaplain in the Army as well, as being a rabbi. Yes, cool. A military man back there. So the title of Rabbi Dr. Mitch Rocklin's talk is, and this draws again on the theme of covenant and race. Exile and judgment. Rabbi Rocklin.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Dr. McDermott. It's an honor to be here. And I won't get into the National Guard Reserve rivalry between the Colonel and I. We'll go Guard is all I'll say. I'm going to find that I've been terminated after this conference, I'm sure. Actually, the trip that I had to Iraq was interesting because one of the main issues that I had was actually the way there. I was sent commercial to Kuwait, so I was very happy. No military plane for me, no getting crammed in. And I got my ticket from the Army, and I saw that it was on Lufthansa. I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors, and like many grandchildren of Holocaust survivors whom I know, memories linger and they percolate down the generations, and it's something that to many of us still just happened. It feels palpable. It feels real. I grew up literally with nightmares about being pursued, this coming from stories that my grandparents had told me at a very young age. And it's something that's hard to describe to many of my friends, but it's something that makes me actually palpably uncomfortable. Just the experience of being on an airplane with German announcements from the cockpit is something that actually made me feel uneasy. It was the only time in my Iraq tour that I actually really felt palpably uncomfortable, even though, ironically, I can wear my yarmulke, my kippah, with absolutely no issue whatsoever on the flight in Germany and in Frankfurt, the airport transfer, and could not do so for the second half of the trip from Frankfurt en route to Saudi Arabia with a stop-off in Kuwait. I think, though, that this was the beginning of a profound experience for me, because the other thing I did on this trip was I worked with German soldiers, and I actually was praying. There's lots of coalition forces in Iraq, of course, and I was in Camp Taji, and I'm sitting there in a flight line tent, or standing there in a flight line tent, and I'm praying, and I'm wearing my tefillin, my phylacteries, the leather boxes, one on the head and one on the arm, and with my talith, my prayer shawl, over me, and I'm praying, and there's lots of people just circulating around, and a couple German soldiers walk in uniform and just happen to be standing right in front of me, chatting in a crowded tent. And this just went on. I'm praying, and this went on and on and on. And there was another American soldier, not Jewish, who just said to me afterwards, he said, I wanted to snap a picture of that. I feel like this is like a historical moment where an American Jewish chaplain is praying with prayer shawl and boxes and all, and 2 German soldiers are standing there admiring him, and here we are fighting the same war together. In a historical span that really, when you think about it, just happened. I'm a historian, by profession. For me, this is not even history. This is like almost current events. And the flip that has occurred. And really, what a wonderful world we live in, and what a wonderful civilization we live in, where this sort of reconciliation is possible in a time span that is so incredibly short. I want to talk about this process, and I want to talk about it on the basis of a framework of exile and return, because I think that it will help us to understand the shift that has occurred in such a short span of history. Just about a little more than half a century ago, Menachem Begin, who is the opposition leader in the Israeli parliament, in the Israeli Knesset, gave what many consider to be the most fiery speech of his career in opposition to the Israeli government accepting German reparations after World War II, saying that it was undignified for the Jewish nation to accept reparations because to do so would inherently lower their dignity. And actually, he implied this. He didn't say this explicitly, but it follows from his remarks. I highly recommend reading them. That reconciliation between Israel and Germany would actually be made more difficult by the acceptance of reparations than would be possible if Israel were not to accept them. And I want to talk about what he meant by that, because he doesn't really explain it. His focus is really on the reparations. But I want to talk about how exile and redemption serves as a process by which true reconciliation is possible, even between those who have perpetuated the deaths of another nation. And I don't mean to imply that reconciliation is the same thing as forgiveness for the perpetrators. I want to be very clear about that. I'll explain the difference. But I want to first proceed by talking about the biblical story here and what we have in the 34th chapter of Jeremiah specifically. That was actually what I thought of when Dr. McDermott suggested this topic of exile and return and its relationship to race and reconciliation. I immediately thought of the covenant that the Jewish people made in Jeremiah, trying to avoid conquest and exile by the Babylonians. And they make a desperate gamble. The king basically comes up with an idea. He says, you know what? We really ought to end slavery. We ought to abolish slavery among the Jewish people. The Bible speaks negatively about slavery, even though it permits it as it was a custom at the time. And the king says, you know what? It's time to live up to our principles. We need to get rid of this institution. And he gathers the entire people together, and they make a covenant, and they say that they're going to set free all of their slaves, and they indeed do. But only for a time. Only for a time. People can't help themselves. They feel the loss of their slaves, and they start forcibly re-enslaving them. And Jeremiah rebukes the people and says that this is basically the last straw. That's going to lead to exile. This re-enslavement of free men who were given their dignity by being freed. I should add to this that the rabbis in the Midrash interpret the second Jewish exile during the Roman period as also based on the deprivation of human dignity from others. They talk about baseless hatred. The Hebrew is sinat chinam, just hatred towards another individual as the cause for exile. And in fact, the sages also blamed troubles during the third Jewish revolt against the Romans, the Bar Kokhba revolt. They blame a plague during that era, during the time of Rabbi Akiva, on a lack of respect towards one another, a lack of an appreciation for the inherent human dignity that we all enjoy. And exile is the punishment for this lack of appreciation for human dignity. So that leads us to a question, which is, how can exile help us recover a sense of human dignity? How can exile help us reconcile with one another? So I think to understand this, we first need to understand what a covenant is. And I don't pretend that I'm going to explain this in a short speech. Many much more qualified than I have written about this. Dr. Berman has a book where he discusses this a great deal. But I just, for our purposes, I want to sum up the covenant in a simple way. And I want to say that this unbreakable bond between God and man, between God and the human being, is the result of a sacrificial connection whereby God is totally devoted to us, as if his very being depends on us, as you have medieval mystics who phrased it this way. Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa were two Christian ones. An anonymous book called the Igerat HaKodesh, the Holy Letter, is a Jewish work from the 13th century that phrases it this way as well. God is so in love with us that he needs us to be co-creator with him in this world. And that's the extent to which he loves us. And we, as human beings, our job is to sacrifice our entire beings to him. This is at the very root of Judaism and Christianity. The binding of Isaac in the book of Genesis, the Akedah, is an act that, as Soren Kierkegaard pointed out, involves the sacrifice of an individual, not for the sake of a people, the way that, say, Agamemnon engages in human sacrifice for the sake of a broader good, but it's the sacrifice of an entire nation before it's even come into being. Isaac's descendants don't even exist yet, and yet he's on the altar. And as a Zionist poet would later put it in the 20th century, Chaim Guri, to be a Jew means to be born with a knife in our hearts, to be born with a palpable sense of sacrifice and suffering and devotion to God in every moment of our lives. Every breath that we breathe is a living moment of life on the altar. We never come off the altar as Jews. And some of the sacrificial rituals that are engaged in the Bible that seem very obscure in Leviticus seek to emphasize this point. For example, Jewish sacrifice was unique in the pagan world in that the priest did not wash his hands after the ritual. Pagans used to wash their hands after sacrificial ritual to symbolize moving away from death. The altar is a place of death, and we come back to a place of life. It's like saying, hey, Zeus, I gave you this cow. Now I'm coming back. I'm going to go live my life here. The Jew never washes his hands because he is living a life that is constantly experienced on the altar. We're not supposed to die physically. We're not supposed to engage in human sacrifice because our very lives as human beings are completely devoted to God. In life, we experience death. That is what it means fundamentally to be a Jew. Now, because we have this covenant, we need a special covenantal home. We don't settle down and put roots in the ground the way that other nations do. We don't have a fatherland. We don't have a motherland. We have a land that constantly requires us to be aware of the source of our inspiration, of our inspired life, to be constantly, as the Bible in Deuteronomy describes it, looking at the heavens. And so the Bible emphasizes in Deuteronomy that there are a couple of things that are unique about the land of Israel compared to the land of Egypt, where we come out of to become a nation. Deuteronomy says that as we enter the land of Israel, Moses says to the people, on this day, you're becoming a nation. You've become a nation to the Lord your God. So we came out of Mesopotamia with Abraham. We came into the land. We went down to Egypt, and we're formed as a people as we enter a covenantal land. Two things that the Bible says are unique about the land of Israel compared to Egypt. One is that it's a land that has no major river. If you've been to the Yarkon River in Israel or the Jordan River in Israel, pretty much the two biggest rivers in Israel, they're not very big. And they're nothing compared to the Nile River. And God wanted it that way. He says you're going to get your moisture from the moisture of the heavens. That's how you're going to drink your water. You're going to constantly be thinking, is it going to rain this year? Or is there going to be a drought? Is God with me? Am I with God? And another thing that I'm very indebted to my wife for pointing this out, my wife Rachel for pointing this out, there's another small little statement in that same passage which casually mentions that it's a land of hills and valleys. as opposed to Egypt, which is a flat land along the Nile River. And the suggestion here, she suggested, and I think she's correct, is that in Egypt you can be, you're at a distance you're at the distance that it appears to be you're at from your fellow man. If you see somebody in the distance down the river, it's flat. You know how far away they are from you. In the land of Israel, you can be incredibly far away from somebody with the path you would take by walking. You might have to go all the way down a hill and all the way up another hill. And yet you can very clearly see them right across the valley. If you've been in the hills of Judea or Samaria or the Galilee, you can see this. So it's a land that pushes us to be responsible for our fellow people. You may be very far from somebody on foot, but you're always seeing them. You're always seeing them right across the valley. That's the covenantal approach. That's the covenantal spirit that we're supposed to have. And so what exile involves, when the Jewish people have to go into exile for their sins of not appreciating the dignity of others, for the sin of slavery and re-enslaving those who ought to be free, for the sin of baseless hatred, what it means is we have to essentially go into exile to recover the covenant that we have violated, to go back to first principles, to remember that we're not rooted in the covenantal land completely the way that other peoples are, but rather we need to rediscover why we're there, what we ought to be doing. And only then we can achieve proper reconciliation. Now, what's interesting is that the Bible describes this trip not as a trip where humans lead the way. Right? Let's take the Aeneid, for example, Virgil's Aeneid. You have Aeneas leaving Troy along with others, and they have to bring the gods with them. Right? If you've been to the Israel Museum or the Bible Lands Museum, you'll see these little teraphim, these little idols. They're mentioned in the Bible in the book of Genesis. Rachel puts them in, under the saddle, to hide them away from her father. If they don't bring the gods with them, then what's going to be? The Bible describes the opposite. God is the one who sends the people into exile and who goes with them. And when Ezekiel is at a river in Babylon, the heavens open up and God appears to him. When Daniel is at the river of Hidekel, the heavens open up and God appears to him. As God said to Jacob long before in Genesis, I'm going to go down with you to Egypt and I will come up with you. This is a unique phenomenon in all of the ancient world where a God is permanently attached to a people and goes with them wherever they go. Athena is the god of Athens. She's not the god of the Athenian people if the Athenian people are kicked out of Athens. That's why Aeneas has to bring the gods of Troy with him. If he doesn't, they're not going to come. But the God of the Bible is always tied with his people. And what you end up having then is the possibility of covenantal renewal. It's what Isaiah describes as new heavens and a new earth. It's what Jeremiah describes as a new covenant that won't be like the old. And yet, also unlike in the Aeneid, the return, and this is unique in the ancient world, the return and the reconciliation is to the very same place where it all started, where we became a nation upon entering out of our exile from Egypt, where we're forged into a nation. We go back to the land of Israel. And so we build a covenant that on the one hand is new, and on the other hand is old. We're renewing our days as of old, as the end of the Book of Lamentations says. It's like Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, described, it's an alt-new land. It's an old, new land, is the translation from the German. And this expression, I think, is absolutely critical to understanding the possibility of reconciliation. Because when we realize that when we don't respect the dignity of others, when we tolerate their enslavement, as happened in Jeremiah, we lose our own dignity in the process, then we can engage in a national renewal that allows us to really fully appreciate the dignity that we owe to others. The Bible even notes that Egyptians, those very Egyptians who enslaved the Jewish people and who drowned Israeli children in the river, their later descendants, those who are not perpetrators, but those from a third generation down the line who want to join the Jewish people, are welcome to join the covenant. And this is the door that the Bible opens to reconciliation. The possibility that I experienced on this flight and with these German soldiers, that when you have a situation where a nation goes into exile and a nation returns, the later generation, the third generation, the fourth generation, whatever generation it is later that comes back from exile, that returns from exile into an old new state where they're still the same nation and yet they're completely renewed in their respect for human dignity, then reconciliation is possible. Because what you're not doing is forgiving. The perpetrators and their evil, that's up to God. We don't forgive. It's not our place to forgive, as Menachem Begin said more than half a century ago. But reconciliation does become possible. Now, I'll conclude by noting that it's not so simple, because in the modern period, we appreciate things like ontological suffering, what Dostoevsky describes in Brothers Karamazov, that individual personality means that it's not easy to reconcile on the basis of national grounds, because the suffering of every individual is infinitely meaningful. And it's a lot harder to reconcile on that basis. But I want to suggest that the Bible also opens a way for us to reconcile even this sort of ontological suffering. Because ultimately, what the Bible is pointing to is the uniqueness of every one of God's creatures and the inherent goodness that we can bring out in each and every one of our lives as an individual personality when we separate from the evils of the past, when we don't follow the sins of our fathers, and when we renew a covenant on the basis of human dignity. And in order to avoid ontological suffering, I'm going to conclude here. Thank you.